Did medieval soldiers fight on Sundays? The simple answer is yes, but it was complicated. You have to understand what Sunday meant to them. It wasn't just a day off, it was the Lord's Day. For a society soaked in religion, this was a serious matter. Fighting on a Sunday was not like fighting on a Tuesday. It carried a spiritual weight. It was, in theory, a sin. The church was the most powerful institution in medieval Europe. It guided everything. It set the rhythm of life, from the daily prayers to the yearly festivals. And the church was very clear about violence. It tried hard to limit it. The world was a brutal place. Local lords fought each other constantly. Armies marched and villages burned. The church saw this chaos and tried to impose some order, some sense of peace. One of their biggest efforts was something called the Peace of God. This started around the late 10th century. The idea was to protect the people who couldn't fight back. Priests, monks, nuns, farmers, merchants, and even their livestock were supposed to be off limits. You could not attack them. It was a call for basic human decency in a violent age. Of course, it was often ignored, but it was a start. It planted an idea, the idea that some things were sacred and should not be touched by war. Building on that, the church introduced the truce of God. This was more direct. It didn't just protect certain people. It protected certain times. The truce of God declared a ceasefire on the most important days of the Christian calendar. This included all of Sunday, from Saturday evening to Monday morning. It also covered major holy periods like Lent, the 40 days before Easter, and Advent, the weeks leading up to Christmas. And it included the feast days of important saints. If you added it all up, war was supposed to be outlawed for a large part of the year. This was an incredible ambition. The church was trying to tell kings and knights and barons when they could and could not fight. The penalty for breaking the truce was severe. It wasn't just a fine, it was excommunication. This was the ultimate spiritual punishment. To be excommunicated meant you were cast out of the church. You could not receive the sacraments. You couldn't be buried in holy ground. People believed it meant your soul was damned to hell for eternity. For a medieval person, this was terrifying. The threat was real. So, in theory, the rule was simple. You do not fight on Sunday. Sunday was for prayer, for mass, for rest. It was a day to honor God, not a day to shed blood. The sound of a Sunday should be church bells, not the clash of swords or the cries of the dying. This was the ideal. This was the world the church wanted. It was a world where God's peace interrupted man's war. Even the soldiers themselves, from the highest knight to the lowest archer, believed this. They were products of their time. They went to mass. They prayed to saints for protection. They believed in heaven and hell. The idea of fighting on the Lord's Day would have made them deeply uncomfortable. It felt wrong. It felt like an invitation for divine punishment. A commander who ordered an attack on a Sunday wasn't just making a tactical decision. He was risking the souls of every man under his command. He was risking his own soul, too. This religious framework colored every aspect of medieval warfare. Before a battle, priests would walk among the troops, hearing confessions and giving blessings. Soldiers prayed for victory, believing that God was on their side. But God was also the God of Sundays. He was the God who commanded rest. This created a powerful tension. On one hand, you were fighting a war you believed was just, maybe even holy. On the other hand, you were breaking one of God's most basic rules by fighting on his day. It was a paradox they had to live with. The official line from the popes and bishops was clear. Lay down your arms on Sunday. But the reality on the ground, in the mud and blood of a military campaign, was often very different. The ideal and the reality were about to collide. So if the church said no fighting on Sunday and everyone was terrified of excommunication, why did battles happen on Sundays? The answer is simple. War is practical. It doesn't care about the calendar. The pressures of a military campaign often overruled the commands of the church. The ideal was beautiful. The reality was messy. The most obvious reason was military necessity. Imagine you are a commander. Your army has been marching for weeks. Your men are tired and hungry. Your supply lines are stretched thin. You finally have the enemy army trapped. They are in a weak position. Your scouts tell you that now is the perfect time to attack, but it's Saturday night. Attacking on Sunday is forbidden. What do? Do you wait until Monday? If you wait, you give the enemy a whole day to rest, regroup, and reinforce their position. They might build better defenses, they might get reinforcements, they might even slip away during the night. The perfect opportunity you had on Sunday morning is gone by Monday. The war could drag on for months longer. More of your men could die from disease or starvation. Waiting was a huge gamble. faced with that choice. Many commanders decided that the sin of fighting on a Sunday was less than the sin of letting their army wither and die. They chose the practical option. They chose to fight. Surprise was another huge factor. Sunday was the perfect day for a surprise attack for the very reason it was supposed to be peaceful. If your enemy is pious, you can guess they will be at Mass. Their guard will be down. They will be thinking of God, not of you. An attack at dawn on a Sunday could be devastating. It was cynical. It was a violation of a sacred trust, but it worked. And in war, things that work tend to get used. A commander might wrestle with his conscience, but the chance to win a decisive victory with a single surprise blow was often too tempting to resist. Then there were sieges. A siege is not a single event. It is a long, grinding process. It can last for months, even years. A siege doesn't stop for the weekend. The besieging army has to maintain pressure constantly. They need to keep digging trenches, building siege engines, and blocking supplies. The defenders, trapped inside the castle or city, can't take a day off from being starved. Disease doesn't stop spreading on Sunday. Hunger doesn't stop gnawing on Sunday. The trebuchet that has been pounding the walls for a week doesn't get a day of rest. To stop a siege for a day would be to give the defenders a precious chance to repair their walls, get water from a hidden well, or even launch a counterattack. A siege was a 24/7 operation. The Lord's Day made no difference. Logistics also played a huge part. Keeping an army in the field was incredibly expensive. Every day, thousands of men and horses needed to be fed. This required a constant stream of food, water, and fodder. Soldiers needed to be paid. Equipment needed to be repaired. Delay was the enemy. A king or a lord might have only raised enough money for a summer campaign. Wasting a day was wasting money you didn't have. If a battle was possible, you fought it. You couldn't afford to sit around and wait for Monday. The pressure from the people funding the war was immense. They wanted results, not pious delays. Sometimes the choice wasn't even up to the commander. An enemy army might advance on you. They might force you into a fight. You can't very well tell them to come back tomorrow because it's Sunday. You have to defend yourself. In that case, the sin was on them. They were the ones who initiated the fight on the holy day. You were just the defender. This was a common way to justify it. Chroniclers writing about a Sunday battle would often be very careful to state that their side was attacked, that they had no choice. They were the innocent party forced to break the truce of God to survive. So you have this constant push and pull. In their hearts, they wanted to obey the church. They believed in the sanctity of Sunday. But on the battlefield, the situation was different. The rules of God and the rules of war were in direct conflict. And more often than not, the rules of war won. The fear of losing a battle, of losing your army, of losing your kingdom, was more immediate and more powerful than the fear of a distant damnation. They would fight now and worry about confessing it later. History is filled with examples of these rules being broken. It wasn't just a theoretical problem. It happened. Big, important battles were fought on the Lord's Day. One of the most famous examples is the Battle of Bouvines. It was fought on Sunday, July 27th, 1214. This was a massive battle. On one side was King Philip Augustus of France. On the other was a coalition led by Otto IV, the Holy Roman Emperor. Philip did not want to fight on a Sunday. He was a pious man, and he understood the rules. His plan was to avoid battle and continue his march, but the coalition army moved to block him. They forced the confrontation. As the enemy army approached, Philip's advisors and nobles gathered around him. They debated what to do. Some argued that they should not fight. It was Sunday. It was a sin. They should hold their ground and defend themselves only if attacked. Others argued that a retreat would be disastrous. It would look like cowardice and shatter the army's morale. According to the Chronicles, King Philip went into a small chapel to pray. He was asking for guidance. When he came out, he had made his decision. He reportedly said something like, "The enemy has chosen the day. The sin is theirs, not ours. God will grant us victory over his enemies." He reframed the situation. He wasn't choosing to break the truce. He was being forced to. And by fighting, he was acting as God's instrument against sinners. With that justification, the French army prepared for battle. The battle itself was brutal and decisive. It lasted for hours. In the end, the French won a stunning victory. King Philip's triumph at Bouvines secured his power and established France as the dominant power in Europe. And how was this victory interpreted? It was seen as a sign of God's favor. The fact that they had won, against the odds, on a Sunday, proved that God was on their side. The potential sin of fighting on the Lord's Day was washed away by the glory of a God-given victory. The outcome justified the means. No one was going to excommunicate a king who had just won such a great victory, especially when he could claim God was on his side. His movements is a perfect case study. It shows the reluctance, the justification, and the ultimate triumph. But it's not the only example. While not on a Sunday, the Battle of Agincourt in 1415 was fought on October 25th, which was the feast day of Saints Crispin and Crispinian. This was another day protected by the truce of God. The English army under Henry V was exhausted, sick, and starving. They were trying to get to the safety of Calais. The French army blocked their path. The English had no choice but to fight. Before the battle, Henry V and his army prayed. They heard Mass, they were spiritually prepared. Their incredible victory against a much larger French force was, again, seen as a miracle. It was proof of God's favor for their just cause. Fighting on a holy day was acceptable if God was clearly on your side. Even during the Crusades, the idea was tested. The Crusades were, by definition, holy wars. The knights who fought them were seen as soldiers of Christ, but even they were supposed to respect the holy days. In practice, this was often impossible. During the First Crusade, the Crusaders laid siege to Jerusalem. The final successful assault took place over a Thursday and a Friday in July 1099. Friday, the day of Christ's crucifixion, was a solemn day of penance. Yet this was the day they broke into the city. The religious fervor of the crusade, the belief that they were doing God's work by retaking the holy city, overrode the normal rules about violence on holy days. The entire enterprise was seen as a sacred act, so the normal timing restrictions didn't seem to apply. These examples show a clear pattern. The rule against fighting on Sundays and holy days was a serious one. Commanders did not ignore it lightly. They would try to avoid it if they could, but when faced with a choice between upholding the truce and securing a military advantage, or even just surviving, they chose survival. And they were very good at creating justifications for their actions. They would claim they were forced into the fight. They would pray for God's forgiveness and help, and if they won, the victory itself became the ultimate justification. It was proof that they had made the right choice and that God himself had approved it. How did a soldier square this in his own mind? How did a knight who swore oaths to defend the church justify cleaving another man's skull on a Sunday morning? The answer lies in the medieval worldview. It was a world of hierarchies and duties, and it had a well-developed concept of a just war. The idea of a just war wasn't new. It went back to theologians like St. Augustine. The church understood that while peace was the ideal, violence was sometimes necessary. A war could be considered just if it met certain conditions. It had to be declared by a legitimate authority, like a king. It had to have a just cause, like defending the realm from invasion or correcting a terrible wrong. And it had to be fought with the right intention, meaning the goal was to secure peace, not just to grab land or slaughter people. If a soldier was fighting in a just war, then his actions were seen in a different light. He wasn't just a killer. He was an agent of justice carrying out the will of his king, who in turn was seen as God's chosen ruler. This framework helped morally justify the entire enterprise of war, and if the war itself was just, then the specific actions within it, even difficult ones like fighting on a Sunday, could be seen as a necessary part of that larger righteous cause. The soldier wasn't committing a sin by fighting, he was performing his duty. The immediate commander, the king, or the duke bore the spiritual responsibility. The average soldier, the archer, or the man-at-arms, was just following orders. In the medieval mind, the sin of giving a wrong order fell upon the one who gave it, not the one who followed it. A peasant who was levied into the army didn't get to decide whether to attack on a Sunday. He was told to advance, and he advanced. His main concern was survival, and his duty was to his lord. If a sin was being committed, it was on his lord's soul, not his. This diffusion of responsibility made it easier for the common soldier to participate without feeling a personal crisis of faith. While religion was also a tool for morale, armies didn't march without their priests. Chaplains and friars traveled with the troops. Before a battle, especially a battle on a holy day, they would be very busy. They would set up makeshift altars and hold mass. They would hear confessions from hundreds of soldiers. This was a crucial ritual. A soldier could confess his sins, receive absolution from the priest, and take communion. In his mind, he was now spiritually clean. If he died in the battle, he believed he had a much better chance of going to heaven. This pre-battle ritual purified the act of fighting. It turned a group of nervous men into a band of brothers, spiritually prepared for whatever came next. It also helped to justify the fight. The priest's blessing was like a stamp of approval. It sent the message that what they were about to do, even on a Sunday, was permissible in the eyes of God. Like God understood the necessity. He would forgive them. And what if he won? As we saw with the Battle of Bouvines, victory was the ultimate proof of righteousness. Medieval people saw God's hand in everything. A famine was a punishment from God. A good harvest was a blessing from God, and a victory in battle was a clear judgment from God. It was a trial by combat on a massive scale. If your side won, it meant God favored your cause. He had actively intervened on your behalf. Any doubts about the rightness of fighting on a Sunday vanished in the face of such a clear sign from the Almighty. The chroniclers would write about it in exactly these terms. God granted the French a great victory, they would say, leaving no doubt about who was really in charge. Either Livin or Lord, there was also the system of penance. The medieval view of sin was often quite transactional. If you committed a sin, you could do something to make up for it. You could pay for your transgression. A knight who fought on a Sunday and felt guilty about it could later make a large donation to a monastery. He could pay for the building of a new church. He could go on a pilgrimage to a holy shrine. These actions were believed to balance the scales. They were a way of showing remorse and buying back God's favor. So, a commander could make a hard-headed military decision on Sunday, win the battle, and then soothe his conscience and secure his soul by funding a new wing for the local abbey on Monday. It was a system that allowed for both brutal pragmatism and sincere piety to exist at the same time. The world of medieval warfare wasn't all about huge, pitched battles like Bouvines. Most of the violence was smaller, messier, and more constant. And in this gray area of raids, skirmishes, and sieges, the rule about not fighting on Sunday became even more blurry. It was a rule designed for a formal, set-piece battle between two noble armies. It didn't really fit the everyday reality of war. Consider a long siege. An army surrounds a castle. The goal is to starve the defenders out or find a weak spot in the wall. This takes months. Every day, the attackers are working. They are digging tunnels to undermine the walls. They are building tall siege towers. They are firing giant catapults and trebuchets that hurl massive stones at the defenses. Is this work fighting? The defenders are also working. They are reinforcing the walls, rationing food, and shooting arrows at anyone who gets too close. Does this activity stop on a Sunday? No, of course not. A siege was a relentless, grinding pressure. You couldn't just take the day off. The men digging a tunnel couldn't stop because it was Sunday. That would give the defenders time to find the tunnel and collapse it. The trebuchet crew couldn't stop. That would give the defenders a day to repair the damage. The logic of the siege demanded constant effort. The religious rule about Sunday, rest, simply didn't apply to this kind of warfare. It was a continuous operation and the calendar had no meaning. Then there was the most common type of medieval violence, the raid. This wasn't about capturing a kingdom. It was about destroying the enemy's resources and terrorizing their population. A small force of knights and men-at-arms would ride into enemy territory. They would burn villages, destroy crops, steal livestock, and kill anyone who got in their way. This was a brutal but effective way to wage war. It crippled the enemy's economy and morale. A raiding party certainly wasn't going to check if it was Sunday before they set a village on fire. Their goal was to move fast, cause as much damage as possible, and get away before a larger force could catch them. They operated on speed and surprise. The concept of a holy truce was a luxury they couldn't afford. For the peasants whose village was being burned, it made no difference what day it was. The violence was just as real, the loss just as painful. As the Middle Ages progressed into the later centuries, the nature of warfare began to change. Bad kings and states became more powerful and centralized. Armies became more professional. They were less like temporary gatherings of feudal lords and more like standing, paid forces. With this change came a more calculated and less personal approach to war. Strategy and logistics became even more important than they already were. The authority of the church also began to weaken. Popes and kings clashed over power. The old unity of Christendom started to fracture. A powerful king in the 15th century was less likely to let a papal decree about the truce of God get in the way of his military campaign than a king in the 11th century was. The rules of war were becoming the rules of kings, not the rules of the church. The practical needs of the state began to consistently outweigh the religious ideals of the past. The idea of not fighting on Sunday didn't vanish overnight, but it slowly faded in importance. It became a nice idea, a pious custom, but not a hard and fast rule that could stop a war. So, in the end, the ban on Sunday fighting tells us a lot about the medieval world. It shows us the immense power of the church and the deep piety of the people. They truly believed in the sanctity of the Lord's Day. They built this ideal, this hope, for a weekly moment of peace in a violent world. But it also shows us the limits of that power. It shows that when faced with the harsh realities of war, pragmatism almost always won. The need to survive, the desire for victory, and the ambition of rulers were powerful forces. The rule against fighting on Sunday was an attempt to hold back the tide of human conflict. It was a beautiful idea, but the tide was too strong. They fought on Sundays because they had to, because they wanted to, and because in the end they could find a way to make their peace with God about it afterward.